So, the Minims, Chapter 3, The Problem. Brocklehurst Grove was built round three sides of a large square. The fourth side was the main road passing through the town. It was ideally situated, just 5 minutes' walk from the shops on the high street, but looking as if it belonged to a country village. The statue of Matthew James Brocklehurst, standing on its tiered pedestal in the centre of the square, looked comfortably provincial. The houses were at the upper end of the suburban market, large, detached, and with very private, well-hedged gardens. Numbers 1 to 3 were on the left-hand side, numbers 7 to 9 were on the right. At the back, furthest from the main road, were numbers 4 to 6, and naturally, number 5, where the Minims lived, was exactly in the centre. The family at number 5 were not well known. They were not invisible, but they preferred not to be noticed, and on the whole, nobody noticed them. Mr. and Mrs. Jarman, who had lived for 25 years at number 4, were very friendly with the Englands, who now lived at number 6. They'd only moved in 4 years before, but they'd struck up a friendship immediately. Some people are like that. Not the Minims. No one on the street had ever passed the time of day with any of the residents of number 5. The Minims, it must be said, had good reason to hold themselves aloof. It was not that they felt superior, having lived there far longer than anyone else. With the exception of Miss Quigley, they would hardly have known what feeling superior or inferior meant. It was simply that they would not dare to mix with outsiders. They were not human, you see. At least not in the normal sense of the word. They were not made of flesh and blood. They were just a whole lovely family of life-size rag dolls. They were living and walking and talking and breathing, but they were made of cloth and kapok. They each had a little voice box, like the sort they put in teddy bears to make them growl realistically. Their frameworks were strong but pliable. Their respiration kept their bodies supplied with oxygen that was life to the kapok and sound to the voices. Their maker was an extremely gifted seamstress called Kate Penshaw. She never knew why she made them. It was just a rather unusual hobby pursued obsessively by a lonely old lady. She never even noticed the life lying dormant in their huge cloth bodies. It was only after she died and was buried that her creations came out of their silence and methodically took over the house. Technically, the property belonged to a nephew called Chesney Loftus, who lived in Australia, but he'd never returned to claim it. There were no complaints about the house being neglected and unlived in. Vinetta kept the windows clean and washed the net curtains. Joshua and the twins took care of the garden. Poopy, in fact, had proved to be quite skilled in looking after the plants. In a variety of ways, they managed to make enough money to pay the bills and to buy this and that from time to time. Being rag dolls, they did not need any food. They did use heating to keep warm and dry. They found that they could see with their bright button eyes. Their felt ears proved successful at hearing, and their mouths learned to open and shape words. Their brains, made of kapok, were no worse, and in some ways much better. than many of the human variety. The Menims had very soon realised that they would need a policy for survival in an alien world. Their first law was to have as little contact as possible with human beings. No outsider must ever notice that they were not made of flesh and blood. When they went out, they hurried there and back, hidden in clothing and wearing brimmed hats, or if the weather permitted, carrying a large umbrella. They learned how to use the telephone. They managed to open a bank account without actually going into a bank. It was perfectly possible in those days. They even rummaged through Kate's old desk and discovered an agent to whom they could pay the rent. That had involved some deception, but Appleby Menim proved very adept at inventing explanations whenever they were required. Chesney Loftus, indirectly, was informed of the names of his aunt's paying guests and of their request to remain on as tenants in the property. This was all done very legally, with both Sir Magnus and his son Joshua signing the tenancy agreement. The agreement was very much in favour of the owner, freeing him from all responsibility for the upkeep of the property and ensuring him a regular income from a monthly rent that could be increased if its real value dropped. The phrase "in line with inflation" was not in use at the time, but that was what was meant. The annual increase was sometimes a little on the high side, but the Menims were able to pay and were, in any case, in no position to argue. Kate, maybe accidentally, had left them well provided for. In her huge workbox, which looked more like a wicker trunk, she'd left a cache of money, which was sufficient to provide for the Menims in the difficult period of transition between her death and their life. All that was very long ago. The Menims, over the years, had become a successful family unit, able to cope with almost anything. They played at living and developed talents. Sir Magnus lay on his bed, and for 2 hours every day, including Sundays, he wrote interesting articles which he sold by post to various newspapers and periodicals. Appleby used to go to the post office in disguises that matched the time of year and buy stamps or hand over the letters without ever raising her head. Joshua made a small but steady income in the various jobs he managed to do without being observed. It was quite difficult for him, since he was nowhere near as clever as his father. Vinetta had learnt to sew, at first using Kate's old treadle sewing machine. Over the years she'd progressed to more modern machines, but she still used the old one from time to time, especially if she was worried about anything. As for the children, they had lessons from Tulip and Vinetta on a regular basis, and were occasionally tutored by Sir Magnus. Appleby was his favourite pupil. She flattered him quite blatantly and pretended to be interested in everything. He would smile at her indulgently and inquire about her pocket money, which she would reluctantly admit was never plentiful enough to buy all the things she needed. Then a helpful hand would reach under the pillow and draw out a leather pouch from which he would take a few coins to hand over slyly. "Say nothing to the others," he'd whisper. "You're a good lass. You deserve a little extra." Subi, the blue Menim, had read every book in the house at least twice. No one could teach him anything, and he was not willing to play at lessons, as the others were. He would sometimes ask his grandfather searching questions, to which the old man, clever as he was, did not always know the answers. Poopy was more like Joshua, good at practical things. As for Wimpy, she was wide-eyed. She was a wide-eyed dreamer with long golden ringlets. She believed in fairy tales and was always waiting for something magical to happen. Little Googles gurgled in her cot or her pram, and was regularly, though unnecessarily, changed and fed. Miss Quigley led the narrowest life, dull and underdeveloped, but that was because she was just a visitor and spent most of her time in the hall closet. They lived cheaply, of course. They did not eat or drink, except as glorious pretend, and they never went on holiday, though they liked to read the brochures. Naturally, they never grew any older. Googles had been a baby for 40 years. Sir Magnus was 70 when he was first made, and he was still 70 when the letter from Australia fell through the letterbox. All that enchanted world was now in peril. For 40 years they had come and gone surreptitiously in the neighbourhood, even managing to shop without being noticed. But, as Sir Magnus proclaimed when next they consulted him, he cannot sit in the same room as a man without observing that he is flesh and blood. He in turn would look across the table at a cloth face with button eyes and would be horrified. Not horrified, exclaimed Vinetta as she sat by her father-in-law's bed. We may be strange. I know we are strange, but surely we're not horrific. At a distance, we look like anybody else. To him, we would be horrific, insisted Sir Magnus, his moustache twitching knowingly. At least at first, he would be. We would be. If he proved to be unscrupulous, he could come round to seeing us as valuable curiosities, and that would be worse. We are not valuable. Even my wedding ring is made of brass. Vinetta looked down at a plain cotton skirt, neatly patched in places. Any curiosity can have its value, declared Sir Magnus pompously. He propped himself up higher against the mound of pillows and placed his hand over Vinetta's. I don't think you realise how unique we are. But you have watched television. You must have realised that man-sized, talking, rational rag dolls do not exist anywhere in the world. Vinetta thought briefly of the Muppets, but appreciated the difference even as she thought. What is unique and curious must be very valuable, pronounced Sir Magnus. He then sank down into his pillows, a gesture of dismissal. Vinetta rose and, carrying away the dreadful letter, left Grandpa to his thoughts.